The Bottom You Can't Climb Out of, Part 1. October in Salem tastes like metal if you breathe too deep. The fog rolls in off the harbor and swallows the brick like a python, and every streetlight halo feels like a bad idea made visible. I parked 3 blocks from Eternal Dawn Pharmacy because the closer spaces felt like traps, like the town itself wanted me to pull right up to the door and step into its mouth. I told myself I was past superstition. 48 cuts the romance from a man. Bills don't care about ghosts, and grief is a landlord with a stopwatch. Emily's laugh still rattled around my skull like pennies in a jar. The row house had her fingerprints on every surface. A wool scarf halfway knitted on the arm of the couch, a mug with the glaze spiderwebbed near the lip, a fat library copy of Middlemarch furred with dust. She'd been gone 5 years and somehow continued to leave things out for me to put away. I never did. Moving them would be a second burial. On the windshield, the eviction notice flapped in the sea breeze, a bright scab of red letters, 48 hours. I had $23 in my checking account and a talent for pretending tomorrow was a rumor. That talent failed when Victor Slade opened the pharmacy door and stared through me like I was already part of his inventory. The building was older than its brick. You could feel it, a patience in the mortar. The blackened facade sucked the light out of the street and the gold leaf sign, Eternal Dawn, peeled like dead skin. I think if I'd brought anyone with me, they would have said something like turn around. But there wasn't anyone left. John Hartley. The man's voice rode the wind like a snapped violin string. Yes, I hated how eager it sounded. He was all elbows and edges, a creature stapled together and sent into the world without cushioning. Eyes that darted as if he expected the night to make an offer he couldn't refuse. Last guy quit, he swallowed. Violently, lock at 1057, front only, never the stockroom. He shoved a ring of keys into my hand. They were cold enough to make my palm ache. You get the job done, you get paid, don't get creative, don't get brave. And before I could form a question, he pivoted and vanished down the fog, footfalls like retreating gunshots. The bell above the door chimed a sound too sweet for the air inside. Rotting herb, copper coin. The counters were heavy oak, dark as molasses, pitted with the soft scars of a history that had involved pestles and knives. Behind glass, apothecary jars held powders the colors of old bruises. A few of the herbs twitched as if trying to remember being alive. The stockroom door was a steel vault with a black handle worn smooth by worry. It breathed out cold, the kind that licks your gums. Night watchman sounded simple on paper. Lock the doors, sweep the floors, keep out the bored teenagers who think mischief is a job. I found the light switches and threw them all at once. The pharmacy hummed awake. Shadows organized themselves. I could see the calendar above the register. Somebody had circled the date with a trembling marker, OCT 16. You develop sense for the shape of another person's hand in their handwriting. Whoever circled that date wanted to blame the paper if it came to it. A clipboard lay next to the ancient cache till its paper crown of dust undisturbed. I wiped it with the cuff of my jacket. Night shift checklist, it announced in block letters. The items were common sense. Sweep front, mop front, close blinds, lock doors. Alarm code at window 1057. Nothing about the stockroom unless you counted the last line written at a slant that felt like panic. Don't touch what touches back. I laughed. The sound embarrassed the room. That happens when you don't like the person you get stuck alone with, yourself. I walked the aisles like a man proving a point. Bandages, aspirin, cough drops, candles. Those jars, though, thick glass with hungering throats. I could see the sediment in some of them pulse when I passed, as if the floorboards had a heartbeat they shared. At 10:37 the street outside thinned to black. The fog pressed its face to the windows like a nosy child. I walked to the front door and tried the lock to make sure I knew its mood. The key teeth were uneven, a bite that would catch if you didn't show patience. Emily had taught me patience. Chemotherapy requires it. So do sad movies and long winters. I went looking for a first aid kit under the counter and in a set of steel lockers in the stockroom hall. I told myself it was housekeeping. The truth. The place had crawled under my skin and I wanted something with clean edges to look at. I opened a locker. The smell met me halfway, bleach poorly masking meat. Inside, instead of gauze and tape, a box sat like it expected to be found. Dust crawled it, and still my fingers left tracks that felt like trespass. The box had a latch that remembered being ajar. I opened it and found paper that didn't want to be read. The ledger pages were stained in the old shades of fear, and everything was written in ink that tried to run off the page and escape. Survival Codex, obey or die. I read it, and something of the person I had been drove a cold nail through my foot and pinned me in place. 1. Lock front door exactly 10:57 p.m. 1 second late equals it's in. 2. Knocking in lockers. Run, never open. 3. Place unopened whiskey bottle on altar shelf by 11 p.m. 4. Never touch the mortar and pestle. 5. Lights flicker twice. Freeze, breathe quiet, or it finds moving things. 6. Phone after 12:03 a.m. Ignore. It crawls through voices. 7. Wipe the display case. Do not touch red jars. My first instinct was to prove that I was not a man who took orders from scraps of paper. Then I remembered roofs and food and medicine, and the way Emily's voice used to climb into a stubborn song when I dug my heels in. You don't argue with rules when there's nothing left to buy you a mistake. A bang from the far locker made my teeth feel too big for my mouth. Something hit the steel with a rhythm that didn't come from fists or knees, too heavy, then too light. I closed the ledger and slid the box back onto its shelf. The lock turned itself with a little shiver as if relieved. At 10:50 I stood by the front door holding the keys like a sacrament. I looked at my reflection in the glass. A man who had spent 5 years building a room inside his skull where pain could spill and pool without drowning him. I thought of what Victor had said. Lock at 10:57. The keys clicked in my hand like teeth. At 10:54 the aisles began to hum. From somewhere in the stockroom hall came a sound like thread pulled through raw fabric. The fog outside thickened into something with intent. A weight laid itself across the roof, and the whole building breathed under it. At 10:56 shapes moved behind the glass of the door that led to the stockroom corridor. They were shadows that had studied being human and failed the test. Their hands ended too soon. Their elbows bent too far. I turned the key in the front door at 10:57 exactly. The lock gave with a crack that had the personality of a broken neck. The room held its breath. The shapes behind the stockroom door stopped pretending they were far away. Elephant steps, something learning to be heavy. The floorboards shuddered their old song. I took the flashlight from the counter and made myself walk toward the stockroom. The beam cut a lane through dust like snowfall, and for a second the pharmacy felt clean, the way hospitals do when they're closed and have just been washed of their witnesses. The altar shelf was there in the stockroom hall, a length of oak dressed with a chipped glass tray and a polite circular stain where a bottle should want to stand. The rules had asked for a whiskey bottle by 11. My hands were empty, and yet an unopened bottle sat dead center, its label the yellow of butter left on a summer porch. My name was written across the glass in a careful hand. I did not put it there. Knock, 1 locker, knock knock, 2 more, then 10. Then 100, a swarm of question marks shoved into steel boxes, the doors flexed. Hinges shrieked like whistles in a long tunnel. I pushed the vault door and it caught. A gray hand bled through the gap, nails like peeled coins, palm pressed open in a plea that might have been a trick or a truth. No, I heard myself say, and slammed with the kind of strength that costs tomorrow. The hand vanished like a breath on glass, and the door clanged shut, and my body remembered what lungs were for. I found the front counter by desire alone. The register's brass face was a drowned mirror. Midnight licked the edges of everything. When the first wail rose, it was small enough to be a mistake. Pipes, wind, a child in a far apartment waking from a bad nap. It stretched and found its shape. It wasn't a child's voice. It had borrowed one. A bulb over aisle 3 popped and glass came down like teeth. I didn't move. I remembered Rule 5. When the fluorescence along the back wall flickered twice, my body did the kind of obedience it had forgotten with Emily. Complete and immediate, I froze. The dark swung a wet arm through the aisle at knee height. Cold fingers brushed my pant leg. What they left behind crawled. The smell was whiskey chewed by something without a throat. Warm liquid tapped my boot. Tick, tick, tick. My stomach rolled up and I coughed up red. I told myself it was stress. My tongue said copper. My nose said rust. At 12:03 the phone burst into life. Not a ring, more like a siren, a mechanical gull tearing at the belly of the night. I watched it. The handset jittered against the cradle as if something under the counter wanted to be born and thought a phone was a good place to start. It rang. It rang. It stopped at 12:04 because rules are gods in small rooms. The silence that followed had a shape. It had knees and an appetite. A shadow peeled itself from the corner near the display case and unfolded until it reached a wrong height. It looked at me without parts to look with. A dozen more followed. Some had mouths sewn shut with stitches the color of funeral ribbon. One wore Emily's face. Not a good copy. A dream version with the wrong number of eyelashes and teeth too even. The part of me that was most alive, the stubborn part, tried to stand. The rest obeyed the rule and stayed stone. "Join us," the tallest shadow said without sound. The words arrived directly in my bones. Crow's cure failed us. The name made an unhelpful door open in my head. Crow. The word smelled like formalin and wet clay. The line of shadows shifted like a school of fish changing their mind. For a moment all the dark in the room pulled toward me in a low tide, then receded. I counted to 10 because Emily had taught me to count through panic attacks. At 7, the lights returned like a favor reluctantly done. At 10, the shapes were gone, the pharmacy restored to the story it told the daytime. My forearm itched. Gray filigree crept along the veins like frost. I did not touch it. At 1:15, 1,000 steel mouths opened at once. The lockers blew out with a sound the air couldn't swallow. I flinched left and my elbow kissed a red jar. It leapt from the shelf with the grace of an acrobat and shattered at my feet. What came out was black oil with bad ideas. It climbed my shoes, found my socks, tasted my skin, and decided I was a home. The world flipped its lens. For a heartbeat I stood not in a pharmacy but in the hospital that had once worn the ground under it. 1920s tile shone with mop water that hadn't met soap. Gas lamps made every face a theater mask. A man in a blood-salted frock coat ground something in a stone mortar while a nurse wept into her elbow. "They're melting," she said, and he smiled like this was whether he had called for a picnic. "Progress demands souls," he said, and the pestle kept time. The patients on the beds convulsed to a rhythm that belonged to a different room. Sheets stuck to them, and the skin that came loose floated and reached and found the mortar because it had been invited. I understood nothing. I understood everything. I wrenched back into the pharmacy the way a diver returns to air. The black oil hummed around my shins, drinking up my heat. The shelves shivered. Behind the glass of the display case, I saw what I hadn't before. Pale faces fogged in the heart of the red jars, mouths mumbling apologies and bargains. One looked like mine after a week of lost sleep. "No," I told the room, and the room smiled with its countless teeth. Somewhere a clock I hadn't seen before landed on 1:17 and dared me to believe in coincidence. I was not a man for heroics. My grand gestures had historically been loud failures, but grief bubbles like a solvent, given time. It eats what eats it. I reached for the first tool with a blade that didn't look like it wanted to betray me. The apothecary axe was a narrow wedge of steel on a handle the color of stormwater. My palm fit it like a promise. I didn't think of the rules, or I did, and decided that sometimes the door only opens if you kick it. I brought the axe down on a jar. The glass shattered the way a scream sounds the day after the funeral. Air rushed in. A face evaporated into 3 whispers and pulled through me without snagging. It left behind a cold that had opinions about my bones. I did it again. And again. With each jar, a pressure left the room and entered me and then didn't know where to go. The oil climbed to my knees, making a case for surrender in a language my nerves didn't want to translate. The mortar and pestle sat on a shelf like a throne with a citizen in it. The stone was not clean. It moved when I stared because acknowledging such things is how you make them real, and they love that. Don't touch it, the rules had said. The part of me that makes bad decisions looked at the part that wanted to go home and sleep in a bed Emily had made and said, "He's not offering you that door." I lifted the mortar. It was heavier than guilt. I brought it down on the tile. The sound it made was not sound. The lights went out and came back as green as fresh bruise. The shelves bowed inward. The jars sang. Some broke themselves to join the choir. A wave of knot hair pushed me into the counter, and the phone leapt from its cradle to dance across the floor like a trapped fish. Something smiled through the crack between two worlds. It wore Crow's face for my benefit, green eyes like lab burners. "You broke the seal," he said inside the memory of my ears. "Feed me." My forearm burned hot enough to brand a history into it. The gray veins executed a careful cursive up to my elbow. I don't remember choosing the words. No, it came out as a rope I could hold. The pharmacy hated that. Every unsupported object went to the floor. The whiskey bottle rolled and thudded against my boot as if to insist that the ritual could still be honored if I would just be reasonable. The oil climbed, burned, bruised, argued. The shadows gathered their cousins and made a city of black around me, tall and trembling. In the middle of it, for a second, Emily stood, the real one, the smile that had tripped me in a grocery store aisle 14 years ago. She reached for me with the hand that had learned knitting as a second language. "Fight," she said, or I made her say it. The distinction is a kind of mercy, not a fact. I swung, I broke, I bled. The axe wrote commas in the air. The room tried to persuade me we had never been anything but a mistake. I found in the debris of myself a small clean thing that refused to agree. When the lights finally gave up and took the dark with them, the sound that followed was not silence, but the pharmacy finding a new shape to be around me, the way water makes a perfect enemy of a stone. I came back to myself on the floor behind the counter, the world smelling like ozone and regret. The phone was whole again, which felt like a threat. The clock on the wall above aisle 3 had lost both hands. The rules lay at my side like a friend that had seen me do something unforgivable and decided to stay anyway. I picked them up with the care you show an animal that has admitted it might not bite you today. The lines had changed. Mine was there at the bottom in a smaller hand, John Hartley pending. The date stared back like a dare. I stood, I listened. The fog pressed its cheek to the glass and made no demands. Somewhere behind the vault door, something breathed in sleep that sounded like a wet page turning. I made the rounds like a man whose job it was to prove nothing had happened. I picked up glass. I righted a jar that had the decency to be empty. When the lights flickered once, I did not freeze. I let myself breathe. The pharmacy didn't take that from me. At 3:00 the building settled, the way houses in old towns do in the small hours, reminding their bones they still belong to the earth. I chewed a mint from the counter and tasted salt. I sat on the stool by the register and let the green hum of the fluorescence comb its fingers through my hair. I thought of how men at rock bottom tell themselves stories about ladders. We make new rungs out of old promises. We lift one foot and then the other and pretend gravity is optional. The bottom I had landed in had walls too slick for climbing. And still there I was, counting the minutes until dawn. Eternal dawn, the sign had promised. I thought I understood. It wasn't a sunrise. It was a kind of morning that never finished arriving. At 5:02 the street lights outside blinked and surrendered. Gray day leaked into the corners. The front door glass found the first honest color it had seen all night and tried it on with obvious relief. I unlocked the door at 5:30. The bell chimed its sweet lie. I stepped into the fog that now felt like weather again. Cities are good at acting like nothing has happened. A gull screamed and sounded like a gull. A trash truck elbowed its way down the block. I stood there until my breath stopped pretending it was winter. In the quiet between trucks, I heard the ocean argue with the shore and lose, like always. The keys dug crescents into my palm. I realized I was afraid to let go of them because there are some props you put down and the scene changes. I pocketed them like a man keeping a promise to the wrong god and started toward the bus stop, my shoes making a new inventory of the cracks in the sidewalk. Behind me, the pharmacy's door clicked shut on a draft. The windows watched me leave. The day did what days do, pretended it was simple. I walked back to the row house and met the smell of old coffee and wet wool as if they were relatives. I showered and the gray map on my forearm did not wash away. It brightened instead, like ink under a blacklight. Emily's scarf waited where it had always waited. I held it and didn't cry because some mornings require too much from a man to give them that too. I lay down without deciding to and woke to evening again, my body choosing the thing it trusted. When I dreamed, the hospital's tile was cool under my feet, and Crow stood beyond a glass that remembered a different century. He tapped it once with his knuckle, and the sound traveled into my ears the way a penny falls into a well. "Tonight," he said, and smiled like a doctor who has finally secured his grant. I woke with my hand already in my jacket for the keys. On my way out, the eviction notice winked from the door like a joke without a punchline. I tucked it into my pocket because there are times you hoard even your defeats. The fog had its appetite back by the time I reached the pharmacy. The bell over the door cleared its little throat. The shelves had rearranged nothing. The altar shelf waited with the bottle it would have whether I wanted it or not. The vault door breathed its winter into the room like a warning about lungs. I checked the clock. 10:37. I told myself the rules were allies, not masters. I told myself many things men tell themselves when what they want is smaller than what the night plans. I swept. I mopped. I closed blinds. I touched nothing that wanted to be touched. At 10:56, the building leaned forward. At 10:57, the key turned. The bottom you can't climb out of, part 2. The second night started before the sun went down. The gray map on my arm itched like it wanted to tell me something in a language I'd never studied. I covered it with Emily's scarf and told myself the pattern was coincidence, that the human brain will make constellations out of bruises if you let it. The scarf held a ghost of her perfume, citrus, and wool. That was enough to trick me into walking out the door again. The pharmacy loomed in the fog, smug as a man who knows your secrets. I unlocked the door with hands that had practiced being steady. The bell gave its false sweetness, and the air inside hit me like a coat of mildew and metal. Eternal dawn never warmed, not even for its hired help. Tonight the aisles felt shorter. The shelves leaned closer, whispering with their jars when I passed. The altar shelf already bore a whiskey bottle just like last time. I wanted to believe Victor Slade had placed it there, but I hadn't seen him since the first handoff. The way the label carried my name, perfectly written, no smear, no tremor, told me the truth. Someone or something had better handwriting than I did. 10:45. The rules lived in my pocket, folded and soft from the sweat of my hand. My thumb traced them without looking. I could recite them now like prayer. Lock the door at 10:57. Freeze if the lights flicker twice. Ignore the phone. Wipe the glass but never the red jars. What scared me most was how quickly obedience had become instinct. I hadn't decided to believe the rules. Belief had happened to me, the way rain happens to men without umbrellas. At 10:56 the fog pressed its claws to the glass again. Something scraped the front window as though writing a message backward. I locked the door on time, and the crack of the bolt sounded like a coffin nail. The pharmacy shivered and exhaled. From the lockers came a knock, then another, then a rhythm, 3 slow, 2 fast like a code. I gripped the counter with hands that wanted to tremble but didn't dare. "Not tonight," I whispered, but the knocking picked up, impatient. When the first locker door buckled outward, I ran. My shoes slapped the tile in desperate punctuation until I slammed the vault shut. Something clawed the other side and the metal bowed in as if breathing. At 11:03 I found myself at the altar shelf. The whiskey bottle was sweating condensation though the room was cold. I set it upright, centered it like honoring a god. My reflection in the glass had too many eyes. They blinked at different times, then resolved back into my face. I wiped the glass case with the rag from the counter, careful to steer wide of the red jars. Their contents shifted when the cloth passed near, as though they craved even that brush of attention. Midnight arrived like an unwelcome guest. The phone screamed again, but I didn't look at it this time. The ring dug straight into my skull, vibrating bone and memory. Emily's morphine-raw voice bubbled through my thoughts, her final weeks condensed into one endless wail. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound was inside. At 12:04 the phone stopped. The silence that followed was worse because I knew it wasn't empty, it was listening. That was when the lights flickered, once, twice. I froze, breath caught in my throat until my chest burned. The air in the aisle thickened, wet and cold, crawling along the floor like an incoming tide. A shadow slithered between the shelves, taller than me, broader than the aisle should allow. Its fingers dragged over the linoleum, leaving trails of slime that steamed in the cold light. It passed inches from my leg, and the urge to run nearly snapped me in half. I stayed stone. When the light steadied, it melted back into whatever crack had spawned it. I exhaled so hard I nearly collapsed, but the night wasn't finished with me. 12:15 from the display case whispers rose. The red jars hummed, their prisoners stirring. Faces pressed against the glass, hollow eyes pleading mouths. One face stopped my heart. Emily. Her hair wrong, her teeth too perfect, but her eyes the exact shade of rain after dusk. She mouthed my name, slow, deliberate, John, John, John. I slammed my fist against the case, forgetting the rules, and every jar rattled in outrage. The hum crescendoed into a scream. The shelves shook, and the mortar and pestle on the back wall quivered like they were laughing. I stumbled back, terrified I had ruined everything. But then the sound cut off, clean, like scissors through thread. The jars went still. Emily's face dissolved into smoke. I dropped to my knees, my body a puppet with its strings cut. The ledger slid from my pocket, pages fluttering open like they wanted to be read. A new line etched itself at the bottom, the ink forming as if invisible hands held the pen. Hartley, close to Breaking. I tore the page free and stuffed it into my jacket, but the mark on my arm pulsed hotter, veins glowing faintly through the scarf. The rules weren't just written outside anymore. They were writing me. At 1:00 the lockers began to chatter, hundreds of knocks overlapping, forming a chorus. I pressed my back against the counter and clutched the axe I'd hidden there after last night. The sound rose until it was no longer knocking but a chant. Not English, not human. My ears bled, hot rivulets down my neck. Still, I held the axe. At 1:17 one locker blew open. Not all of them, just one. A child's voice spilled out, raw and broken. "Help me." Small hands clawed at the air, gray and thin, reaching toward me. My axe wavered. Every instinct screamed to grab that hand, to save what could be saved. But Rule 2 bellowed louder, "Never open." I shut my eyes. "I can't." The words cracked me in half. The hand shriveled, bones snapping like dry sticks, and withdrew. The locker slammed shut of its own accord. Silence fell heavy. At 2:00 the pharmacy gave a sound like laughter. It came from the walls, deep and rumbling, as though the building had been waiting for me to show weakness. I leaned against the counter, shaking, counting heartbeats until they stopped sounding like footsteps. By 4:00, exhaustion chained my eyelids, but I didn't dare sit. The mark on my arm crawled higher, reaching toward my shoulder. When dawn finally bled through the glass, I staggered out into the fog, drunk on fatigue and fear. Victor Slade was waiting outside. His grin showed too many teeth. "Still breathing? Good. You lasted longer than the last one." I wanted to throttle him, to demand answers, but the words died in my throat. He patted my shoulder, eyes flicking to the scarf hiding my arm. "Don't worry. It only hurts at first." He slipped into the fog, leaving me alone with the truth I didn't want to face. I was becoming part of eternal dawn. The rules were not protection. They were a slow initiation. And tomorrow night, I'd be one step closer to the bottom you can't climb out of. The bottom you can't climb out of, Part 3. By the third night, the pharmacy no longer felt like a building. It felt like a stage waiting for me to forget my lines. Every breath carried weight, as if the walls were jealous of my lungs. The gray veins on my arm had crept past my shoulder now, webbing across my chest like frost on glass. I wore Emily's scarf tighter, though it did nothing but hide the truth from me. The fog outside was heavier, almost black. It clung to the windows as though it didn't want to be left out. I unlocked the door and the bell chimed its sweet deception. Inside, the whiskey bottle already stood on the altar shelf, glistening with condensation, label pristine. Tonight the name wasn't mine. It was Emily's. The rules in my pocket weighed more than they should. I unfolded them, hopping for the familiar lines, but the handwriting had changed. Angrier, sharper. New words bled into the margins. You belong to US. The original rules blurred until I couldn't tell where old commands ended and new ones began. At 10:57 I locked the front door, the bolt cracking into place like a rifle shot. Silence followed, thick and unnatural. Then the first knock sounded from the lockers. This time it wasn't random. It was a steady beat like a heart. Boom, boom, boom. I gripped the counter until my knuckles screamed. The phone rang at 11:30 early, its shriek clawing at my nerves. I didn't touch it. Instead, I watched as the receiver lifted itself off the cradle. It hovered in midair, cord stretched taut, and a voice bled through the static. "John," it whispered, Emily's voice. "Help me, please." My knees buckled. I wanted to answer. I wanted to believe, but I remembered Rule 6, ignore. I squeezed my eyes shut, every muscle in my body trembling. The phone dropped to the counter with a bang that echoed like gunfire. The line went dead. My chest heaved, but I had obeyed. Midnight split the room apart. The lights flickered twice. I froze. The air thickened, heavy with rot and whiskey, crawling with whispers. Shapes moved between the aisles, elongated, stretched too far to be human. Their shadows pooled across the floor like oil. One brushed my boot and cold fire shot up my leg. I held still, lungs burning, until the flicker ended and the creatures melted back into the dark. At 12:45 the display case rattled. The red jars pulsed with inner light, their prisoners screaming soundlessly. One jar tipped forward and cracked. Black oil oozed out, slithering across the tile toward me. I swung the axe down, shattering the glass. A face rose from the spill, half-formed, eyes like bottomless wells. It lunged, claws raking across my arm. Pain seared through me. When I looked, the gray veins had spread farther, reaching my throat. The ledger appeared on the counter without me placing it there. Its pages flipped themselves until I saw the newest line. John Hartley, vessel nearly ready. I screamed and hurled it across the room, but it landed open, pages fluttering like wings. The handwriting crawled, letters shifting, spelling something new. Feed the mortar. The pestle quivered on its shelf, stone grinding against stone as though alive. I backed away, shaking my head, but my body betrayed me. My hands itched to obey. I clenched the axe tighter, whispering to myself, not yet, not ever. At 1:30 the lockers burst open. Hundreds of gray hands clawed out, grasping, reaching. Their nails screeched against the floor, against the walls, against each other. A wave of corpses spilled forward, emaciated bodies dragging themselves toward me. Their mouths gaped, sewn shut, eyes black and endless. One wore Emily's face again. Her stitched mouth trembled, trying to speak. I swung the axe, cleaving shadows, glass, bone that shouldn't exist. Each strike freed a scream. Each scream burned into my skull. Black oil splattered the floor, reassembling, crawling back together. The creatures shrieked, their voices overlapping until the sound became a physical thing, crushing my ribs. The mortar and pestle pulsed with green light. Crow's voice slithered through the air. Progress demands souls. Yours is ready. I dropped to my knees, axe heavy in my hands. The gray veins now reached my jaw, pulsing with sickly light. The rules in my pocket burned, paper smoldering, ash curling against my leg. I ripped them out and watched them crumble into nothing. The pharmacy no longer needed me to read the rules. It had written them into my blood. At 2:00, the walls bled. Green light seeped through cracks and the shelves bowed inward. The jars shattered one by one, unleashing storms of trapped souls. They swirled around me, clawing, screaming, begging. The air turned liquid, thick with despair. Crow's face materialized in the ceiling, eyes blazing, mouth a furnace of emerald flame. "You broke the seal," he thundered. "Now you will feed me." The black oil surged up my body, covering my chest, my throat, pressing into my mouth. I gagged, choking, thrashing. My vision narrowed, edges blurring into darkness. The last thing I saw was Emily's twisted face inches from mine, her stitched mouth tearing open. She whispered, "Now we suffer together." The oil swallowed me whole. And then silence. When I woke, I was inside the walls. My body was gone, nothing but gray stains on the floor. My consciousness floated, trapped, staring out through glass that had never been windows before. Across the pharmacy, Victor Slade walked in at dawn. He stepped over the carnage without flinching, sighing as though this was routine. He set the phone back on its cradle, straightened the altar shelf, and picked up a newspaper as casually as if opening shop. "Another one down," he muttered. He pulled a slip of paper from his coat pocket and tacked it to the door. The ink gleamed fresh in the morning light. "Help WANTED. Night watchman, urgent." I screamed, but the sound stayed trapped inside the glass. The walls hummed with satisfaction. Behind me, countless voices joined in chorus. We were all jars now. And eternal dawn never ends.